Okay, everybody, 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12. Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. For the Father up above is looking down in love. Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. That was terrifying on my part. I think of that song often when I come to this text because that song, those words are so true for this text that we're in this morning. Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. For the Father up above is looking down in love. Be careful, little eyes, what you see. We are in the story or the account of the life of King David. King David, as we've seen over the last several weeks, he has been on the rise in the sense that he was not the king of Israel, but he's anointed to become the king, and he has this mighty battle against Goliath, and he wins the victory, and everything in sort of up to this point is kind of like rising to the sort of crescendo that we found last week, Sunday, when you have this amazing text where you see David is absolutely at his best, and he is extending kindness, mercy, grace to Mephibosheth. It's truly an amazing account. This series, as you've noted, is called The Rise and Fall of a King. Everything up to this point has been about the rise of that king. We saw David at his best, but today we see him at his absolute worst. From this point on in the life of David, there's a downward slope. If you were to sort of simply put it on a chart, it would be rising. Mephibosheth, a high point in the life of David, followed by an absolutely horrendous incident that we see in our text today, and then the downward slope, the rise and fall of a king. God chose David to be king at the very beginning because he was looking for somebody different than Saul, looking for somebody that was a man after his own heart, and he found that in David as a young man. And one of the things that's true about your heart, about my heart, about David's heart, is that the heart constantly needs to be cared for. Our hearts change. It's kind of like the man that says, well, honey, I told you that I loved you when we got married. Why would I need to tell you it ever again? You do. Over and over and over again. Lord, you know my heart. You saw it from the beginning, but my heart doesn't matter after that. No, it does. It matters all the time. Because one of the realities that we face is that our hearts, though they start out in a certain way, can actually become bad. They can actually become corrupt. They can become twisted. They can actually become unguarded, if you will. Proverbs 4:23 puts it this way: keep your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life. Another translation renders it like this: above all else, guard your heart, for from it flow the springs of life. Above all else. That's true, isn't it? Like, the heart is the most important thing here, isn't it? Yeah. In fact, Jesus taught so much about the heart, didn't he? In Mark chapter 7, he said that it's what's inside of a person, what's in their heart, that's what comes out of a person. It's not about the external things that one does. It's about the thing that actually is the source of those external things. It's the heart problem. The heart has to be in the right place. So many have started out in the right direction, but because of an unguarded heart, they've yielded to temptation and fallen into grievous sin. As we'll see from today's sermon, David had an unguarded heart, and it cost him everything. To understand what happened to David, we turn our attention to two chapters in 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12. As I mentioned, in the Bible that's in front of you in the chair, it's page 262, I believe, that you start on. And in this text, we learn about David and what that unguarded heart looked like. This text is a difficult one in Scripture. It's difficult, first of all, to talk about, and it's also difficult to hear about. And quite frankly, this is the kind of story that you don't put in the children's Bibles for good reasons. And yet God does not hold back from showing us the gravity of our sin, how it is worked out in the life of men like David. His purpose for including this text in the Word of God is for our instruction, to serve as instruction and warning for us, as guardrails for us, lest we do what David did. So in this message, I want to give you 4 things to consider about David's unguarded heart as we walk through 11 and 12. First of all, in verses 1 through 4, we discover the condition of an unguarded heart. Notice how the text begins. It says, "In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem." Now, just to pause there for a moment before I read the rest of the text, this alone is an interesting passage because we need to set the context of what's happening here. When you go back to the earlier parts of 2 Samuel chapters 5 and beyond, David has now officially become the king of Israel and Judah. He is now the king over all of the land. And he's beginning to sort of vanquish the enemies and move them all out and establish the kingdom of Israel in this territory that they are dwelling in. And everything starts to settle down in the kingdom. He, in many ways, is at a place where things are fairly calm and at rest. Things are going really well. That, in fact, should be an indicator for us right out of the gates as we approach this text. Because sometimes it's out of the context when actually everything is going really well that things actually can become complacent in our lives. We actually can get to the place where we say, well, there's none of these pressures on, and so I'm kind of relaxed about it, and now my foot comes off of the gas pedal a little bit, and I don't sort of maintain the same vigilance or diligence that I once did or that I need to continue to do, and so we relax a little bit. It seems in David's case that may be true here for him as well. We begin in chapter 11, verse 1, that we're told that it's springtime, and this is the time when kings would normally go out to war, and so that's in fact what happened. David sent Joab and his servants with him, and they ravaged the Ammonites. They besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. Normally kings go to war, but David didn't. Now, this is not uncommon, in fact, for David to not go. There are other places where he didn't go to war. This wasn't the first time that David didn't go to battle. Earlier in chapter 10, verse 7, he stayed back as well. Later on in 2 Samuel, some of his own people close to him even said, "You should stop going to war. There's too much at risk if you go to battle, our king." But in this particular occasion, David stayed back, and we're not told exactly why he stayed back, just that he stayed back. Now, I can tell you that when you study this text and you read everything around you about this text, that there are a billion pieces of speculation that people have about this text. So, for example, one could surmise that, well, David in this situation deliberately chose to stay back because he had these motives that were going to lead him to do what he does in the text with this woman called Bathsheba. That there was some kind of prior conversation with Bathsheba, that there was some kind of prior connection. They met at the local 7-Eleven store, or they met at the local employees, gathering where everybody was together because Bathsheba's husband is Uriah, and that's one of David's mighty men of valor. We could speculate all day long about that, but the text doesn't tell us that. In fact, the text isn't even really on Bathsheba per se. It's actually on David, because we're talking about David's problem. What we do know is that David, for whatever reason, decided to remain at Jerusalem. And when he remained at Jerusalem, a problem developed because he stayed back. He wasn't where he should have been. Sometimes we allow ourselves to go into these situations. We place ourselves in situations where we shouldn't be. There would be a better place for us to be rather than there, because quite frankly, being there is going to cause us problems. David, whether he intentionally was there because of Bathsheba or he just decided not to go, it is in this sort of context that David now decides to wander out onto the porch. We read in verse 2, "It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful." Now, it's helpful to understand sort of the geography, or I should say the archaeological, geographical, topographical information a little bit behind here. I've been to this location, actually, when I went to Israel years ago, as some of you probably have been there as well if you went. You actually know where David's palace is, and you actually can look out from sort of the area where the palace is, and you can kind of look down, and you can see the homes that would have been down there. It wouldn't have been uncommon for a king to walk out of his palace, and you could look down upon the citizens and the homes of the citizens that were there. The homes were right there within your view. So that paints a little picture here in terms of David going out in that late afternoon in the springtime, and he's walking on the roof of the king's house. Now, whether David was deliberately looking for something, we don't know. The text doesn't tell us. It just tells us this is what he did. He walked outside. And when he walked outside, we're told in the text that he saw a woman, a very beautiful woman, who was bathing. It's also really helpful to know, by way of kind of instruction about what this text is and is not saying, is that some people, unfortunately, have thrown Bathsheba under the bus, and the text doesn't permit us to do that. This last week when I was preparing this, I reached out to my family and to the ladies in particular, our family, and wanted to have a conversation just about, from a woman's perspective, when you read this text, what do you see? I mean, I'm a guy. Hopefully that's obvious. I'm a guy. And as a guy, I read it from a guy's viewpoint. But how does a woman read this text when they read about it? And so one of the things I was conscious of in preparing this text is that there are people who actually blame Bathsheba in part for what happens here. I want to say to you at the beginning that that's not right. There's absolutely no indication in the text whatsoever that Bathsheba did anything wrong here. But you say to yourself, wait a second, but she's having a bath outside. Look at this. It says right there. I mean, who does that? Who goes out out into the area? Well, David's on the roof looking down, and who has a bath out so everybody can see this woman? Who does that? Well, the other thing we need to understand, that the type of bath that Bathsheba was having, she didn't have back in that day, water that flowed and nice plumbing in the city of Jerusalem and nice hot water with sort of jets in the tub. There was no porcelain bathtub. There was no bubbles. There were no bath bombs. There was no scenty things or whatever, candles lit, nothing like that. She was in her own home. She wasn't out on the roof. She was in her own home, and the way the homes were constructed, she had to go outside to actually have this bath. But the bath and the type of bath she's having is also really important to understand. Notice with me at the end of verse 4, it said that she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. It is quite likely that the bath that Bathsheba was having was actually one of ritual purification. She had just finished her menstruation, and 7 days had to be waited, according to the book of Leviticus, before she would no longer be considered unclean, and she would go through a period of ritual cleansing in this bath. That's the type of bath that we're talking about. It was quite likely just something that one would sit in and they would probably pour water over themselves. Changes the scene a little bit, doesn't it? In a sense, it could be, in fact, that the author of this text is also trying to show us something about Bathsheba. What? Not that she is to fault in the picture, rather that she is a pious woman. That here is Bathsheba who's actually giving attention to ritual purification according to the law. So the picture gets painted that this should be magnifying David and minimizing what Bathsheba did. And that will become hopefully clearer as we go through this text. So in not going to battle, though, notice what happens in verse 2. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch, was walking on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. Hardly her fault for being beautiful, isn't it? It's not at all. And David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Then she returned to her house. I want you to note several things here in this text that I've just read. I want you to first of all notice that every single temptation typically follows a process. There's a typical sort of evolution or a process in temptation. Notice it right here in this text, what happens with David. We read in verse 2 that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. He saw that she was very beautiful. It typically begins with the eyes, doesn't it? Then notice the second thing in verse 3 is that he sent and inquired about the woman. And then thirdly, verse 4, he took, and she came to him. This threefold process is common in a number of other accounts in the Old Testament. For example, take you all the way back to the very beginning, the first temptation and the first sin, that which is found in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. And what happened with Eve? She saw that the tree was a delight to the eyes, and she desired the tree, and then she took from the tree. She saw it, she desired, she took from it. In Joshua chapter 7, verse 21, a man named Achan went in and he took the spoils of war that he wasn't supposed to take, because God was clear to leave the spoils of war alone. Do not touch them at all. And he took some and he put them underneath his tent. He hid them under his tent. But the text tells us that Achan saw the spoils of war, he coveted them, and then he took them. When we turn to the pages of the New Testament, in James chapter 1, verses 14 and 15, we read that each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. And this text, it's instructive to us in James. It's so much like what's happening with David. The text in James says that we are tempted when we are lured and enticed by our own desires. Those two words, lure and entice, are actually two words, one from the world of fishing and one from the world of hunting. The idea of being lured is there's a hook. Your own desires are like a hook in your life. The idea of your own desires being not only luring you, but also hunting for you. There's a trap that's set. You're lured and you're enticed by your own desire. This idea of being hooked, but also you've set a trap for yourself. It's your own desires that did it, actually. And here is David now in 2 Samuel 11, and he follows the same process, doesn't he? He experienced the process when he saw this very beautiful woman bathing. Then he inquired, and then he took her. His desires, because he was there with an unguarded heart, his desires lured him in. lured him in, and the hook was set. The trap was laid. The animal was caught. At this point in the text, when you read 2 Samuel 11, you realize that actually you want to scream out to David if you're there. If you were on another rooftop, you want to say, David, don't do it. David, stop. You want to go over and just slap him to knock some sense into him. Wake up, man. Do you not realize what you're doing right now? Because David is there, and in this moment, he has an opportunity to stop. Right there. You know, that's exactly the way it is for all of us, too. Regardless of what the sin is, we all have the opportunity to stop. When we're confronted with the luring enticement of our own desires, when temptation reaches a point where it's like the next step is a critical step, friends. This next step, you literally at this moment have to choose what you're going to do with this next step. But David didn't stop, did he? He was completely unguarded, and he allowed his desire to overtake him. His heart was lured and enticed. And then he took it to the second thing. He inquired. The inquiry was not a good one. Notice what he discovers when he inquires, hey, who is this? He actually had to send somebody to do that, by the way, which is interesting, isn't it? One of his servants goes, tell me who this is, and that person comes back and reports, well, this is actually the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Well, the Bible tells us, as you kind of read it in other texts, that actually Uriah the Hittite is one of David's mighty men of valor. He fought, actually, for David long before he was a king. He was one of the men who followed David with absolute loyalty and who was willing to lay down his life for the king. This is a guy who he works for. Uriah works for David. You would think that when the servant person comes back and says, hey, by the way, this woman that you're inquiring about, it's Uriah, it's his wife, you think that David, stop right now. Right? You think, okay, like if I wasn't going to stop, if I'm not going to stop at the seeing, I'm going to stop now at the inquiring, right? Because now the inquiring has revealed that if I proceed any further, this isn't just any man's wife, which would also be horrible, but it's Uriah's wife. The level of disloyalty that David displays, not only to God here, but also to Uriah, is off the charts. Regardless of what he heard, when he inquired, he decided to proceed still. You're on the rooftop and you're yelling, David, stop! So David then, his next step is to send messengers, and took her. And she came to him, and he lay with her. Then she returned to her house. You can only imagine if sort of like Hollywood or somebody else decided to make a movie of this, what grotesque things they would read into this account, and twisting and perverting and maligning Bathsheba and all that, because frankly, you read the text and it leaves plenty of room for your mind to imagine. But the text is deliberately quiet about Bathsheba here. There's no sense of romance here. There's no sense that there was sort of like prior knowledge of each other or anything like that. It's just the facts. David saw, he desired, inquired, and he took, and he laid with her, and she went home. Period. Done. I think it's instructive to know some things about David at this point. You may be surprised by this text about David. I mean, after all, when you read the story of David, it's sort of like, this guy's a great guy, right? Like, you read about him. He's young. He's youthful. He's described as ruddy and handsome, and, he takes on the giant and all that, and all this good stuff about David. But then you're like, it's kind of like a shock to the system when you read this part. You're like, what just happened? Well, I would suggest to you that there was a building to this. There was a building to this moment. It wasn't what just happened, which is actually true for most sin in our lives. There's usually a building to the moment of sin rather than it just happened. When reflecting on the account of David and Bathsheba, it should be pointed out that by this time, David actually has 7 wives. 7 wives. Right in 2 Samuel chapter 3, so a few chapters prior to this David, we discover the names of those wives: Michal, Ahinoam, Abigail, Maacah, Haggith, Abital, Eglah, as well as concubines that David has children with. To take a look at David's history, for example, with women, in fact, David, first of all, in 1 Samuel 17:25, Saul the king promises to give his daughter to whoever defeats Goliath, and David is going to be given Saul's daughter Merab, but then he ends up being given Michal. But David then goes ahead after that at some point in time, and he adds 2 more wives, Ahinoam and Abigail, in chapter 27. And then thirdly, David, while he's being pursued by Saul, who wanted to kill him, Saul decided to give his daughter Michal, who was actually married to David, and actually who loved David, we're told, gave her to another man. When David took over the kingdom and Saul had died, 2 Samuel chapter 3 tells us that Michal is now taken from her current husband and given back to David. In a heart-wrenching story, you read about how this poor guy is actually following his wife along the roadway, weeping as she's taken away from him and given back to David. Michal is upset later on with David because David is immodest in his dance on the way back to Jerusalem one time when he's coming with the ark, and she seems jealous and upset that David uncovered himself, we read, before the eyes of the female servants as one of the vulgar fellows shamefully uncovers himself. And David says, basically, I've had enough with you. And we're just told in the text that she never had any children with David. And then we're introduced to the story of Bathsheba. And then as you end up David's life, he is on his deathbed in 1 Kings. We are told that he's very old, and somebody decided that it's a good idea to bring him a very beautiful young woman to keep him warm, but the text tells us that he knew her not. Why do I paint that picture for you? Because it's the truth about David. It's easy to glamorize David and see him as one who on the rise is all glorious and wonderful, and then there's this one thing and then it's the fall. But the reality of this, I think, shows us that there's a little bit more to David, much like there's actually a little bit more to all of us too. What this shows us is that David is actually just like the other kings of the culture. Not to excuse his behavior at all, but he's just like the other kings. And he also is not following God's law for kings. It's given in Deuteronomy 17. Actually, Deuteronomy 17 made it clear that you're not supposed to be like the other nations and the other kings. You're not supposed to have actually multiple wives and multiple horses and increase your wealth. You're not to be like them. That's not how God wants you to govern. But David ignored that. Our text tells us also something, I think, about David's sexual desires. Based on this information, it appears that the king, now that he's a king, maybe even viewed himself perhaps as entitled, actually. Now, it's hard for our culture and context because we don't live in an era that's like that. What we have to understand is that this was common in the day for kings. That doesn't make it right. It just makes that's what the culture was like. David is a man of his culture and has this possible sense of entitlement to have whatever he wants, whenever he wants it, and this includes taking many wives and concubines. Surely today we frown upon the idea, rightfully so, that you can have multiple wives and that you can have concubines. Because God said to David, don't do that. don't do that. With this background in mind, we return to some of the sin where David is on his porch at a time when the kings go to war and he's tempted in the sight of this very beautiful woman. All of that sits in the background with David. David is not, as a man who comes out on his porch, a man that's never been with a woman. He's not a man who's just married to one wife. He's a man that's married to several wives and concubines. And yet what he does in this text is sin. And he knows it. He takes the wife of another man. Now, how does David go about doing that? I think it's important for us in our day to kind of look at this text and realize that if you were Bathsheba in that day, this text doesn't tell you much about Bathsheba for sure. It doesn't say much about her. But what it does show in this text that there potentially is, and it's hard to not see this, that there's a significant, what we call today, a power differential that exists between David and Bathsheba. We're familiar with these kind of things in our day, right? So for example, Bathsheba, who is she? Well, she's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Who is Uriah? Well, he's an employee, if you will, of King David, right? He's one of his mighty men. David is the king. He holds all the power. So that maybe helps us to understand when David sees her and he inquires and he takes her, we have to ask ourselves the question, we have to ask, was Bathsheba agreeable to this relationship? Did she say, I can't wait to go see the king. I can't wait to have sexual relations with the king. I don't think so. There is a power dynamic because the king can do this. He summons her, and we're told nothing about her being complicit with this, wanting this, or also not wanting this. We're just told that David took her. Now you can imagine if the king summons you, the kind of power that the king wields, you really don't have a whole lot of say in matters. And you can say, well, she should have screamed, she should have whatever, but who's going to come and help you? We don't know any of that. We just know that David took her. It paints a picture of David as a man of his time who is living in this context and who takes Bathsheba, and this power differential exists between her and Bathsheba, and it seems like compliance was probably not an option for Bathsheba. This has raised significant controversy over years and commentators in terms of what actually happened to Bathsheba. Was she sexually assaulted? Was she raped? Was it simply that she wasn't raped per se violently, but rather what happened with Bathsheba was that she was certainly taken advantage of here. She had no power and authority in the situation, and some of that could be. Which only magnifies the kind of sin that's taking place here, doesn't it? So as I've probably articulated already, personally, I don't think Bathsheba should be portrayed as a temptress in this account at all. Text gives no indication that she is. If anything, she's put into a very difficult, almost impossible, if you will, situation that she could do nothing about in that culture. And the king exercises his kingly authority in a way that's consistent with kings of this day, but displeasing to the Lord. So the point of all of that is to say that David seems to be a man with sexual passion, and when he sees Bathsheba, he has an unguarded heart, and he gives into it. Instead of guarding his heart from that sexual sin, David's heart is left open and vulnerable. He doesn't stop at key critical moments when he could stop. And instead of stopping, he just heads straight into it. A message like that about David sits heavy. It also raises for us significant questions about ourselves, about our own hearts. Are you playing with fire? Are you seeing how close you can get to sin without falling into sin? Are you walking right to the edge and going, I have not crossed the line, but I'm right on the edge? I'm out on the porch, but I haven't done anything. It's okay. Friends, that could be about any sin. When I ask those questions, it's not just David's sin here. Because the reality is that's what sin is for us, right? So many times there's a desire to the desires are so strong we get as close as we possibly can, but we don't cross over yet. But the biblical answer isn't to get close to sin, is actually to get as far away from it as absolutely possible. You maybe have heard sort of the statement, something like this, that adultery rarely happens all at once. It is a result of 1,000 small compromises, or no one falls into adultery suddenly. It is preceded by 1,000 small steps. It's so true with a lot of sin in our lives. Sin doesn't just happen. Somebody doesn't just go, I had no idea what happened. I had no idea how that happened. Yeah, you do. Yeah, you do. You see, you had 1,000 small steps that led up to that point. You're left now with an unguarded heart. In most cases, that's what happens with sin. It's because I have allowed myself little indiscretions along the way, until all of a sudden, in a moment when I'm weak and I'm vulnerable and I'm whatever, the crash happens. If adultery is typically the result of 1,000 smaller compromises or steps, then how many compromises are already being made? Years later, David's son Solomon gave some pretty amazing advice. Solomon was actually the son of David and Bathsheba. After David did what he did, he ended up taking Bathsheba as his wife. They had another son, and that son was named Solomon, and we know of him a lot in Scripture. And Solomon had his massive share of problems with women as well, far worse than his father. He married 600 women and 300 concubines, and they drew his heart away from God. And yet, somewhere along the way, David's son Solomon wrote the book of Proverbs and gave advice to his own son that is so relevant for us today. I want to read just a little bit from this. And in Proverbs chapter 5, he says, My son, be attentive to my wisdom, incline your ear to my understanding, that you may keep discretion and your lips may guard knowledge. For the lips of a forbidden woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil. David's son Solomon is writing this to his son, so it makes sense that he's talking about a woman who does this. But really, the thing could be flipped completely, right? Like we all know that it's not women who are bad here. It's simply the fact that Solomon's talking to his son. So this is the advice he gives to his son. But if mom was writing this, right? So it was reversed or different. The mom might say, hey, listen, watch out for, like to a daughter, right? Watch out for those guys that are out there. They're dirtbags, right? Stay far away from them. Have nothing to do with them. And this is kind of the advice that unfolds. Notice in verse 8, keep your way far from her. Do not go near the door of her house, lest you give your honor to others and your years to the merciless, lest strangers take their fill of you. In other words, if you go there and this happens, your life will be decimated. And you say in verse 14, I am at the brink of utter ruin in the assembled congregation. My life is an absolute devastation. And then he says to his son, drink water from your own cistern. This is a nice poetic way of talking about be delighted in your own spouse. Flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets? Don't do that. Let them be for yourself alone and not for a stranger with you. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth, a lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breast fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. Why should you be intoxicated, my son, with a forbidden woman? Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23, it starts, guard your heart above all else because it is the wellspring of life. He goes into 5, he talks about watch out for this adulterous woman in chapter 6, in chapter 7, in chapter 6 he even says things like in verse 24, do not desire her beauty in your heart, do not let her capture you with her eyelashes. If you go to your neighbor's wife in verse 25, none who touches her will go unpunished. You will get a beating from the man who lives in that house. He who commits adultery lacks sense in verse 32. He who does it destroys himself, on and on. The advice of Solomon to his son. Stay far away from temptation. Do not go near. Do not go near. How are you doing? How near are you to whatever it is that might be something for you? It's sin. Are you on the edge? Have you put your toes over? Stop! Right? Stop. Stop. Now's the time to stop. Not after you take a next step. Stop. Back up. Back up. Back up. Retreat. Flee. Run. That's the message here. The heart matters. Notice what Jesus said in Matthew 5 about the heart. He said, you've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. The heart is problematic. And he says, deal with your sin in a radical way. If your eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. He's not literally asking you to gouge out your eye, although some people in history did. He's telling you, be radical in the dealing of your sin. What kind of radical action do you have to take to stop doing what you're doing before you take it any further? It's not too late to do what David never did. Nip it in the bud. Get some accountability. Guard your heart by removing certain inputs from your life that may influence you. Those little steps that affect your heart. Those little indiscretions that ultimately lead sometimes to a massive sin. David failed, but you don't have to. Learn from his sins. That's the first thing, and you're thinking, Lord, it's 11:30. The rest are not like that. What we discover second in verses 5 through 13 is the cover-up of an unguarded heart. In a very brief yet jarring statement, verse 5 says, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, I am pregnant. It should go without saying that there are consequences to sexual sin, and this is one of them, isn't it? God told us to abstain from sexual morality for a reason. He knows what's best for human flourishing, and he knows that when people are actually sexually promiscuous, there is the possibility of this. What's happened, it's interesting, since 1965 in the United States, did you know that that's when contraceptives were available to married women only? Did you know that in 1972, that's when they became available to unmarried women? I don't say that to fault women about this issue, by the way, at all. It's just to point out the historical fact that actually contraceptives became available. Women could acquire those, and women had a concern over that. And because if you were sexually active, you were in a dangerous place, weren't you, if you were unprotected in this regard. And so here you have in the 60s, the sexual revolution that hits. And with the sexual revolution, there's a whole lot more, of course, promiscuity that happens. But the sexual revolution got sort of rocket launched, or whatever you want to describe it, exploded. Why? Because of contraceptives. Because the moment you introduce contraceptives into sort of a married woman being able to have contraceptives, now you introduce the possibility of greater increase of adultery. Because now people start to think to themselves, hey, I've got protection. I don't have to worry too much about this. I can go and I can have kind of sex with whoever I want, whenever I want. Both male and female begin to think this. The same is true with regards to 1972 when it became available. So these things sort of put sort of that kind of lifestyle on sort of hyperspeed, if you will, because now people felt like, oh, I've got protection. But, you know, if you go to like places like the CDC, I don't know if anybody here would do that, but if you go to a place like CDC, you know what they tell you? They tell you, like, there's no such a thing as safe sex. Like, they're very clear about that. You can have safer sex, right? Because you have protection. But it's safer, not safe. The only actual safe sex is actually between one man and one woman, husband and wife. That's the only absolute 100% foolproof way of not getting an STD is actually by being monogamous, one man, one woman. That's it. All of those other diseases actually could be removed and eradicated actually just simply by following what God said a long time ago, that is, do not actually commit sexual immorality and do not commit adultery. And that's, why did God say that? Because he's a cosmic killjoy and he hates people and he wants people to be miserable? No, because he knows what's best for human flourishing. He knows that this is best. You know, if we actually had in culture and society, everybody finally said, hey, listen, you know, we're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to commit sexual morality. We're not going to commit adultery. Can you imagine what the families in the United States of America alone would be like? Can you imagine what children would be like without, they would have a father around? Right? Like, can you imagine economically what would happen in the United States of America just by obeying one thing from God? So here you have David, though. He discovers, I am pregnant. David didn't have all of this contraceptive stuff going on. There was stuff that's way back there that people did, and yes, they did, but it didn't happen there. She was in a moment of heightened fertility because she had just finished her menstrual cycle. And the text brings that out to deliberately tell you and I that there's no one else who could have done this but David. So David here concocts a plan here at this moment, doesn't he? Instead of stopping at this point, he could have stopped at this point. He hears that Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, is pregnant. He could have stopped and said, Lord, I'm so sorry, forgive me. And he could have done what is right. But he doesn't do what is right. He buries himself further in it. He covers up his sin. Friends, this is what happens when we sin. We actually wrestle with this, and the thing that we think we would never, ever do, and we see it in somebody else who does it, and we think, my goodness, I would never do that if I was me. When you're in the situation, it's amazing how crazy you get, and you'll figure a way to sort of evade the consequences of the very thing. I wonder sometimes, and if David was around today, if this was today, if there was Planned Parenthood, would David have said, hey, listen, Bathsheba, you need to go down and get this taken care of? Well, I can't imagine David would do that. Well, I can't imagine David does what he does in this text. He covers it up. You see, we will do the craziest things when we've stepped into sin and we don't know how to get ourselves out of it. We'll cover it up, hide it. But sin always has a way of coming to the surface and being found out. And so what does David do in the text? I won't read it all to you, but from verse 6 on, what does he do? He says, go and get Uriah the Hittite off the battle lines. So he brings Uriah the Hittite off the battle lines, and he says to him, hey, Uriah, buddy, old pal, friend of mine who's been so loyal. That's not literally what he says, but you know what? To reward you, why don't you go down and wash your feet? Go to your home and wash your feet, which is a sort of a way of saying, go and have relations with your wife. See what David's doing? Cover up. If I do this, he will think the child is his. But you know what Uriah does? He doesn't go down. He sleeps outside the door of David. David even sends a gift, actually, to his house ahead of time, which I'm sure Bathsheba got and was going, why is this, there's this gift here. But he sleeps outside the door. When that doesn't happen, a second time he brings him in and he gets him drunk. He's like, I'm going to get this guy wasted, then I'm going to send him home. Then he'll do this. And he still doesn't go home. And then when he realizes that cover doesn't work. So now at this point, David could still stop, right? He could still stop, but he doesn't stop. What does he do next? He says, listen, Joab, commander of the army, I want you to take Uriah and I want you to put him on the front line where the battle is the fiercest so that he will die. He actually has the man killed. And you know what also happens in the text? It's not just Uriah that dies. There's other soldiers in David's army that die. The collateral damage from David's sin as it ripples out from David to all of the other people that are involved and all of those families you think that were there that were devastated that day because of David's one sin, his choice. That's David here in this story. And this happens with David and his mass cover-up. And he even sort of, when Uriah is killed, what does David do? He goes and he takes Bathsheba and says, here, come into my home. And he's painted in this text almost like, wow, what a wonderful guy, right? I mean, her husband dies and he comes and rescues her because she's now a widow. But the thing that David did, we're told at the end of the text, displeased the Lord. It displeased the Lord. So we move from that second point, and we move to the third point. In the chapter 12, it begins with the confrontation of an unguarded heart. Now this king whose unguarded heart has led him into grievous sins, who tries to cover it up and hide it, is now confronted by a prophet, Nathan. Nathan comes to David and he said, hey, David, I want to tell you about two men that were in a city. I want to give you a little story to sort of think about. And he tells this story about these two people. One guy was really rich, one guy was really poor, and the one guy had just one little lamb. This poor guy, this one little lamb. And he paints this picture of how this rich guy decided to take the one little lamb from the poor guy that was his only lamb. And David's like, who is this? Who is this guy? You know, he should be put to death for what he did. That's terrible. And you know what Nathan says? Verse 7. Nathan said to David, you are that man. You are the man that I'm talking about. You're the one who stole the little lamb from this poor guy. You're the one. I did all this stuff for you. I anointed you as king. I delivered you out of the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house. But you've despised the word of the Lord in verse 9. You've done what's evil in his sight. You've struck down Uriah. You've taken his wife. You've had him killed with a sword. Therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, David. You're on the down, David, now, the fall of the king, because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite. All that David did was not condoned and blessed by God at all. The text is just telling us this is how far we can go in our sin. All of that finally brings about the last point in verse 13 to 15 of chapter 12, the confession of an unguarded heart. It took that long for David to be broken. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord also has put away your sin, and you shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child who is born to you shall die. Then Nathan went to his house. Now David is repentant. We are so fortunate to have in Scripture the Psalms, the book of Psalms, 150 of them, many of them written by King David. It's in those Psalms we get to see the other side of David, his heart for God, his love for God. But it's in this text we see his absolute disloyalty to God and how he broke the heart of God. And yet what we do get to see in David's life, that we get to see in all of our lives, is that there is repentance that is available. Yes. That there's restoration that's available. Yes. That no matter how the depths of our sin, how deep it is, there is still opportunity for repentance. God still is a merciful and forgiving God who brings us out of the muck and the mire, brings us and takes away all of our absolute disgraceful deeds and acts, and he actually can bring redemption to them. And so in Psalm 51, we have what we know was written by David after he was busted by Nathan the prophet. We've actually sung songs, or a song at least, from this text. Create in me a clean heart, O God. And renew a right spirit in me. Cast me not away from your presence, O Lord, and take not your spirit from me. Restore unto me the joy of my salvation, and renew a right spirit within me. David said, have mercy on me, O God, According to your steadfast love, according to the abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity. Cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before you. Against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Behold, you delight in truth in the inward being, and you teach me wisdom in the secret heart. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Hide your face from my sins and blot out my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with a willing spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and